Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Burkhard Mausberg. I'm the president of the Small Change Fund. Just quickly, we want to let you know that this session is being recorded and say a little bit about Small Change Fund to get us started. We act as a capacity amplifier. We're helping individuals and organizations across the country improve the environment, reduce poverty, and support Indigenous reconciliation across the country. We have helped over 300 organizations achieve their goals, having raised more than $25 million for community-led projects. We want to acknowledge today that we live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many Indigenous nations across the country. The work we support spans these diverse lands, from the Coast Salish territories in British Columbia to the homelands of the Métis and the Prairies, to the traditional Mi'kmaq and Innu lands in the east, and across the north where Inuit, Dene, and other Indigenous peoples continue to steward their ancestral territories with strength and care. We acknowledge that these lands have been cared for and governed by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial and continue to be vibrant and sovereign territories today. Thanks again for joining us to our webinar on the training program for Get on the Bus. Our goal with this program is for high school students across the nation to have access to free transit and to receive valuable training on how to use transit. And the Get on the Bus program is critical for us at Small Change Fund, and here's why. For one, it's a project that has many diverse benefits, and some quite staggering in their numbers, and you'll hear about some of those today. The work is also connecting our country just a little bit at a time when those wanting to divide us get louder, because we're building a national movement for youth transit. And finally, our project is also about developing tools and best practices while engaging youth, two critical undertakings in shaping public policy today. This work wouldn't be possible without the support of several key funders. So today I want to thank the RBC Foundation and the Trottier Family Foundation for supporting the work, but I also want to do a shout out and express deep gratitude to the McConnell Foundation for providing support to get our journey started a few years ago. Thank you to all of our funders. Now, if you have questions, we ask that you wait until the end. There is a Q&A feature on Zoom we invite you to use, or you can also enter your question at the chat. We anticipate that the webinar will take maybe 45 minutes, so we'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. Now, let me introduce you our first speaker. Dan is the director of our Get on the Bus program and the visionary behind elevating youth transit into a national movement across Canada. Dan?
Thank you, Burkhard. I'd like to start by thanking Small Change Fund. I've been working in Kingston through my role at Limestone District School Board on this, developing this since 2012. And in about 2017, there were a lot of calls from different communities across Canada just asking about, how does it work? How do you do it? And it was a call that I made in 2021 and connected to Burkhard and Small Change that really gave it legs, or I guess wheels. And that's when the Get on the Bus movement was started. Now, today we're going to focus on training, engagement, and the ride guide, in which you'll get a copy after the webinar in your email box. However, I'm going to start with this quote that really kind of started me off in Kingston. If kids don't know how to ride, they won't if they don't know how. And a story that I want to start today off with is a recent story that I was in Ottawa doing a presentation for Enviro Center. I walked to the front desk that day, and a young man in Ottawa looked up at me at this front desk and said, "Are you from Kingston?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You taught me how to ride the bus." And it's those moments that in my life, I get to see why this matters. That was a decade after he took the training. For 20 minutes, he saw that. So to start off in Kingston, it is critical. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One, in Kingston, yes, high school students ride for free. But it was really that moment in 2012 that I looked at the director of education and said, who's going to train them? Who's going to show them? In our mid-sized communities, we don't necessarily show students this because transit systems aren't always able to do that, and they're built differently across Canada. So some of the bigger picture things, not just the policy, but the training, what made it work in Kingston really, in a bigger picture, was an innovative plan of working together and iterating between institutions, partnerships, and supporting each other with, where we can move the needle with our different organizations. From 2012 to 20, Kingston Transit was really growing, and express buses and infrastructure was part of the bigger picture. But really, it was a people-first approach. On the same side of this, you have different systems integration. What we see now is investing in youth and transit, whether it be the policy side, the training or engagement side. It acts things that we say we want to. It's multi-solving, whether it be the climate plans, whether it be mental health, mental wellness, volunteering, youth labor, or not youth employment. All of this ties into the bigger picture of why it's important to invest in youth and transit. This is a visual of in Kingston of what we got it to eventually and what we still do. My voice is, if it was 2 weeks ago, it would be pretty raw. As I go out, and I still do this at every high school in the city, showing here though of what it looks like with grade 9s in our community, seeing what it's like to get on the bus, feel the bus, hear the bus, like all the real other parts of learning, putting the bike on the bus, which I have some stories here, but they do it together. They see it, they feel it, they beat their passes in this case, and they get on that bus for a little loop. Now, some communities, you might not be able to start by on a bus, and I get that. The one thing I've said since we've started the Get on the Bus movement is start somewhere, whether it's the policy side, the engagement side, the training side, the nexus of youth and transit. I think, in my opinion, over the years, I've seen are somewhat underexplored, like this is a great opportunity for not just youth, but the families, right? And so this is what it looks like. And I'm lucky to be part of in Kingston, and also really lucky now, my passion to be part of in so many communities across Canada, whether it be advice or coaching, webinars or support. That's what we do at Get on the Bus. Now, the reason why I had to couple it with the policy side, though the rest of the webinar will be about engagement and training, is because these numbers speak to this. So there was a recent report that was done, commissioned by the Ontario Association of School Board Officials, and they found some really neat things for impact, right? Why I say this is because these numbers are coupled with training. We've never done it any other way in Kingston. So annually, adding almost 200,000 rides by youth, and to me, you have to stop to think that ride means somebody is going somewhere that they want to get to, they need to get to, they have to get to. It also ties into education, that they're not just students, they're youth, but as students, reducing absences in our community, giving caregivers, parents, guardians time back, and also tying into something that I'm passionate about, reducing greenhouse gases by modal and behavioral shift, by eliminating car trips. Now, as I said, I wanted to couple this together with the policy side of what we advocate for, but today is about training. The tips and tricks of being on the bus, myself and others, for literally, I don't even know how many hours now over the years, but I started with hair. After this webinar, we'll follow up when complete with the ride guide, which is really just what we're talking about today. And by the way, the recording of this will actually be available on our website as soon as we can kind of get it up there in the next week and a bit. So I hope it's a resource like we're trying to do for so much in this movement of keeping it open, accessible, and really about sharing, okay? To start, I'm kind of thinking about the building of the training programs and then the training itself as kind of a how and a why, right? The how to build a program, things you have to consider, I would say, especially starting off or working towards this on-bus training. On-bus orientations, there is a beauty of the students being able to see, feel, normalize together. And I do think it's important that they do it together, right? They get it together before the automobile, before other opportunities. They get freedom, accessibility, responsibility, independence with responsibility. And I do talk about that together. Training is important because you can also reduce risk, whether that's around the bus. Keep in mind, some of these youth, if it's a yellow school bus they've been on for their whole life, they don't know that maybe there's an arm that doesn't stop traffic, right? These are important pieces of safety to normalize together. And what I also think is very valuable is giving all students a really good first impression. you know. Starting small, as I said, this webinar is showing you about some of the work that we've been able to do in Kingston that has grown and become very systemic, but it took time. There is this part of the story from 2012 to 15 when we were iterating, we were figuring it out, we were seeing what they needed to learn, right? The other thing I'd say as I get older is one thing I've really realized is the importance of peer-to-peer contact, communication, leadership. Something I say now every bus ride is how many students here already use the bus? And students pop up their hand and I say, these are the most important hands here. It's not me for the next 20 minutes, you know? It's the fact that they can help and train and support each other. I do know as well that younger students in grade 9, generally 14 or so, use it from at least the stats we've had through a master's thesis in Kingston, about 3 times less than older students, right? So point is, as they go through high school, gain more responsibilities, more autonomy, more independence, they become more connected to our communities. And then also the general idea about accessibility of how to design a program and implement it in training. This idea of systemic training that they all get is very important, but there's more we can do. And we're working on it, student ambassador programs and other ways to really make sure the learning stretches out as well. So planning a workshop, if you're looking at an on-bus workshop, I'd heavily obviously suggest getting a dedicated bus. These buses are taken off the road in collaboration with the Transit Authority here. I work on a moving bus. It's a planned short circuit around the school. It doesn't have to go anywhere, honestly. What I've realized, it's about, if you can get there, it works on a sitting bus too. It's just easy to get their attention of the reality, when the bus is moving, it's a real experience. And as close as we can get to that real experience as possible, I think is important. I mean, working with youth and your schools or even not-for-profits. In Kingston, it is done through the school system. But if you're starting somewhere, training can happen before the policy, right? It could be a grade 9 class that goes out on a public bus, right? And goes somewhere. So my point is to look for opportunities, limit the group sizes. If you're doing it on a moving bus to about 30, 35, 40 students, whatever sitting happens. I've had some times where I was like in rush hour, early days when I was learning, I just put 45, 30, 50 students on a bus, which is possible because you can stand, right? But it just didn't work as well for articulating, for getting your message across. And honestly, working with students in grade 9, they can eat you up. And so these tips and tricks of how to be a good presenter, a good trainer, and work with youth, I think are very important. And of course, coordinate with your local school or organization. This could be a small program started off maybe with a youth employment club, right? Or something like any way of getting students on the bus in a safe environment, learning it, seeing it together at a young age creates impact and impression, as I'm always blown away. In fact, like I mentioned in Ottawa there, like that really inspired me to continue doing what we're doing. I know what we're doing matters. So parts about the trainer. You're on a moving bus. There's a motor or there's an engine, sorry. And you have to be able to own your audience in a way, right? Sometimes I feel like I go into character. It's about the jokes. It's about the personalization. It's about it being relative information. So making sure you're speaking loudly enough, walking up and down that aisle, another good reason why you want them to sit down, quick pace, good jokes, questions, ask them and engage them. And we'll be moving on and talking a little bit about that in a second here as well. Using your own experiences and asking for their experiences. Even though I'm a 6'4" guy, asking these students saying, how many of you folks use a bus? And they put their hands up and then say, listen, I'm not trying to scare you, but what's a route you use? Just to point out that these other grade 9s, I use the 501, I use the 16, and I say good, because when you start there and you look at a big map, it can look scary. But at the end of the day, you just got to start somewhere, just kind of like building a program. And they know their routes that then eventually compound and connect. Starting the workshop, I often say, just get them seated. That does make sense over the years. I brief students in front with the bus, not only showing them the bike rack, but talk to them and build some empathy, right? And it is true. What I've just realized that if I start off and say, listen, I've done this presentation 100 times this week. I only need 15 minutes. Please don't speak over me. They empathize, right? And always encourage their questions as well. But I find that I've built it and helped build it into a bit of a story, right? And I'd like to talk a little bit more of some of these pieces of the topics that we actually dig into, I explain a little bit what to expect, that we're not going anywhere. We're on a moving bus. I'm going to be pointing out some stories, and I really get into it. And so some of these benefits or the topics that I like to talk about is just this idea of, the big buckets, whether a program development, right? The bigger picture of building youth transit programming, policy, training, engagement can be done different ways. We're seeing some great stuff across Canada, whether it be murals, or I know in Edmonton, they were working with local Girl Guides to work on a scavenger hunt. Again, how can you use the transit system to engage youth? Because when you engage youth, you engage families, right? And that's what I've noticed here. And transit systems take some time to both invest in and build, but to build culture too, Some of the things, not only in the bigger picture, again, in investing and valuing youth in your transit strategies, in your policy, in your engagement, but I talk about some of these whys for the youth. It's not just the how, though I'll talk about that. It's not just the app and the planning. These are imperative and important. But you know what gets some students is, I think, painting the picture of responsibility and autonomy and independence, whether it be their first job. How many students here have a job in grade 9? Maybe a couple of hands go up. How many students here in grade 12 think you'll want a job? Most hands go up, right? These are the types of things that are important that engage them, that get them seeing why this is valuable, right? Whether it be getting them to their first job, though I say, when I was a kid, I had to walk to my first job and I loved it. It was at a convenience store. But imagine having more access to the job you wanted, a skill set you want to learn, a better paying job. This is what it gives, Talking about reducing family costs, if you're able to work within the transit system, this is reducing your family costs, right? So these are some of the things that are really highlighted, or even the idea of getting to school, right? Sometimes the student, if they miss the yellow bus or they can't get home, or maybe they have to drop their younger brother or sister off at the other school, sometimes they're embarrassed of getting late to go into class. There's a lot of reasons why, and it ties into the bigger economic story of investing in youth in transit. And then there's, of course, students that care about the environmental side and pointing some of that out. Look at folks and this is one thing I've done before. Look at, these are not actors. One car, one person, one car, one person, right? Of normalizing and showing that in our communities, often it's not mostly maybe the most efficient way to get around. And the environmental ramifications of that aren't always good. With the GHG so high in Canada tied to transportation, I personally believe that investing in youth transit is one of the best things we can do, right? Because it builds and it takes time. But I often say to students sometimes too, I'm not from the future, but I am from the past in a way of describing why I think they might use it, the value it gives them, and for some students, that idea of reducing emissions, but also building multimodal citizens, right? That's important. How many people walk out just to get in their car? My family, sometimes we have a car, of course, in our case, but we use the bus. I have a daughter that uses the bus. My wife uses the bus. We pick up, we just work together on making it better, right? And ultimately, longer term, from a transit point of view, too, it ties into, you're building people that have impact in transit and care about transit because transit helped them at an earlier age. So we're building citizens that get to kind of understand transit and care about transit. And I think that's an amazing thing. And then also that's that line about we are congestion, right? We really are. Right. So with the same idea, not just from the bigger picture, but from the why, talking about how many students here have a friend that went to a different school, you can meet them. How many students here have to volunteer in high school? You can get there. How many students here know that there are different opportunities in high school to maybe go to do a trades program or a co-op? This helps, right? And I fundamentally have seen and how this helps the social side of normalization as well. Now, and then there's the bigger idea of community benefits, right? Just moving around, strengthening the economy, freeing up time, getting more opportunity. We're investing as Canadians from federal, provincial, municipal levels in different youth-based programs. We got to get them there, right? Sometimes the inefficiency is the fact that we're spending money on different programs, but the students can't maybe get there. That is a big problem, right? So a couple other pictures of more of the topic-based stuff is, if we look at me in front of the bus, I do start them off there, and this is a true story, and it is true, you can use it, but it's true for me. I had a pop tire. I had never learned how to actually put my bike on the bus, right? And that was a big problem for me because I had a pop tire. So people were looking at me, I'm sweating, cars are flying by, the operator can't come off. I was 30. This is the stuff that on a more topic level, I think is important, right? But then there's also other stories. Like I point out, and it's hard for youth, they're 14, right? You see no vaping, no smoking. I point that out. Obviously, there's no vaping and smoking, but then there's another sign that says no food. And I said, well, can you eat on the bus? And they say, well, you can't vape, you can't smoke, obviously, so there's no food. And then I say, you know why sometimes you need a no food sign is because at the end of the day, it's a true story. I saw a guy get on the bus eating a bowl of cereal. And I tell them this and I make them laugh, right? I point out how absurd it kind of is slurping his cereal beside me on the bus. And these are the types of things that are highlighted, and bring story to it. Sorry, I'm just looking at a quick note here. And so these are some of the things that I think are important to embed. And one thing that I'd like to say as well, some other topics, right? And these are why I think each community has to kind of use some of this potentially, but also the nuance of your own community, how it connects to maybe other transit systems, right? All the other pieces to building a program is going to be mostly unique to a community, but there's still a fundamental base of using transit. The bikes, as I said, passes and paying, whether it's digitized or not, or cash, these things matter for youth to interact with. Getting on the bus. I know it sounds small, but it can kneel, right? Where to tap, how to sit. And I always stop and say, I've gone too far in the presentation. How do you stop this thing? Right? And one student said to me just this year, they said, do you mean the little red buttons aren't an emergency exit? And they were serious because they've never done it. And that's okay, right? But this is why our work and the work that we're doing across Canada and the importance of education and training, I think, is so important. And then also getting off the bus, something I'm very proud of that I've seen in my day. I'm sitting in the back now, this man, bald hair, just sitting there, and I see youth that get off the bus and they thank the driver. And I always have said that for the 14 years I've done it. I said the last thing you do when you jump off and you look both ways is to thank the transit driver because they're getting you to where you want to go, fighting traffic, bad weather, and you're there safe, right? And trying to really give some support that way. Mapping and planning the routes, another great way to communicate with them. I don't have a presentation, right? I'll pull out my phone and show them the transit app, ask other students what they use. Often it's Google Maps or Transit. There's other apps they use which normalize. Also, some other topics to consider, and one that I think is imperative is safety and etiquette, showing courtesy seating, talking about their backpacks, right? Talking about music, food, as I said, waste or recycling up front. Just even letting them talk to the driver, pointing it out that if you have a question, you can talk to the driver, right? The operator. Finding and waiting for the bus, using your phone as a light if there was, multiple buses stopping, just ways to make it safer for youth. And then one thing that I think is super important that I've seen, and I was asked, it was actually about 5 years ago, I hadn't said it the same way, but I think it's really important, is again, there are 14, in high school, older youth on a bus, I say to them, listen, if you were in a public park and you were sitting on a bench and somebody sat beside you that made you feel uncomfortable, would you just sit there? And you often get no. And then I show them, get up and move. Like you're going to sit beside people. It's a public place. It's a bus. But if you feel uncomfortable, get up and move, hang on to stuff. If it's busy, get up to the front and stand near the driver. You don't have to talk to them or not. It's not about that, but just get up and show them that they can advocate for themselves and move. Safety on and around the buses I've talked about, also riding safely, properly, and politely, right? And I think it's a great opportunity to connect. I think it's a great opportunity to show them what that first good experience is like, almost mimic it, right? So this was a lot about, the how, I think, of the program, the topics, the why. And I could already think that talking to communities across Canada, there would be nuance, right? I was just talking to a young man this morning from PEI, actually, about some of the training that they're looking at. And he had a great idea about route planning, maybe takeaways that can give to students that they can plan routes around their school to really say, hey, I can get to the mall from here or a job, right? I always highlight as well that though with independence comes responsibility, right? And I think that's an important piece that they are growing, that it's important to tap if that's the way to do it. But just to let them know that this is a great opportunity. I often have done this as well, just to show that it's really a transferable skill set, when I lived in Korea, and so I'll have a busload of students and 안녕하십니까, 한국말 조금 알았습니다. And all of a sudden you go, That's just like I speak a little Korean. It's not great anymore. It's been years. But my point is, I highlight whether you go to school, work, college, trade school, university, travel, if you learn it here, you have a backbone and a skill to create opportunity for the rest of your life, no matter where you go. Transit training isn't just about the ride. I've over my time, earlier on, I thought it more was, but what I've seen now, and going back to what I said earlier, I'm not from the past, or I'm not from the future, but I am from the past. I've been working on this for quite some time in my life. I love it. And it's about independence. It's it's real about the value in equity, and ultimately, in a time like Burkhart said, we feel like sometimes I think that we're getting pulled apart as communities. Lean in, like thinking of Jane. Lean in. Okay. Speaking of which, this is where I'd like to hand it over to a young colleague and friend of mine, somebody that inspires me. At just 17, Sophia Young, she led a small organization in Regina, Better Bus Youth, to help work with the municipal government there to allow for 13 and under for free. So she's a huge transit advocate, and I just like to hand it over to Sophia. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So thanks for sticking with us this long. Yeah, so I am a coordinator here with Get on the Bus. And I was also a transit advocate for a very long time. And it's through my experience of being a transit advocate and working with so many different youth that I was able to kind of see the importance of having transit training because when youth have transit training, they feel more confident to ride. And it also helps to bring the parents along. So I'm going to show you a little bit of the transit training side, except from a little bit more like youth perspective, just to kind of help. Oh, let's go on to the next slide, where I can give it to you from a little bit more of a research perspective. So last year, I had a really great opportunity to work with Get on the Bus to create a research report around the feasibility of free for youth transit and training in Edmonton. We were able to work with 13 partner organizations as well as parents, youth, and program coordinators from these partners, where we were able to talk to them about what do youth need in order to get on the bus, and for parents and guardians to feel like it's okay for youth to get on. And it was from the study that we really saw that not all youth have ridden the bus before. And this is a really who rode transit and parents and guardians who didn't ride transit. The ones who rode transit felt more comfortable allowing their kids to ride. Meanwhile, the parents who didn't ride transit had a lot more fear towards the transit system. And that's something that they pass on to their kids. And that's why training is so important, because when we do training right, we can transform risk perception. Instead of kids feeling like that's controlled by other people, it's from an untrusted source, something that's unknown, uncontrollable, unequitable, and can have permanent effects in their life if they do it wrong. Training can help show them that it is a voluntary activity. It's something that they themselves can control. It's something that's very familiar. And it's something that they can control to get to anywhere they need to in their life. It's something that's natural and something that can be done chronically throughout their life, be it right now or being done later on. And it can be equitable because it helps so many different people who rely on the transit system every single day. And since there's a trusted source there to go and help them along this journey, it can be very helpful to youth because it helps to lower that risk. Because it shows that transit can be something that's known. That if they make a mistake, it's okay. It's only a temporary effect. And that there's so many visible benefits, like Dan went over just a little while ago. And through this entire process, through this training process, we help to create certainty in youth that they can ride transit confidently, but also competently. And that helps to bring parents along the way. Except you might be wondering, how exactly do we do training in a method that helps to lower some of these risks, perceptions? Well, let's talk about that on the next slide by starting with checking some of our own biases that we have. So I just want to encourage everyone here to do a really quick reflection. When you think of youth, what is one word that you would use to describe them? And I'll give you a moment to think. And if you want, feel free to put it in the chat. Do you feel like youth are powerful, capable, and responsible? Or maybe do you feel like they're apathetic, they're rowdy, or they're disruptive? Yes, I see some people saying capable. That's awesome. Um, if some people are coming from that other perspective where you see that youth are more rowdy or disruptive, that's okay too. The only thing, though, is that youth are able to feel whatever perceptions you have of them. So if you're there as a trainer and you're trying to talk to the youth, but you think, oh, they're disruptive kids, I don't want to be here, I don't want to talk to them, of course these kids are going to pick up on it. And instead of being a trusted source, you end up becoming an untrusted source. So that's why it's so important that when we're doing this training, we use all the wonderful words that many of you people are putting in the chat, seeing that they're capable, they're curious, they're resilient, they're innocent in the sense that they don't know what the transit system is yet. So it's okay that they may make mistakes along the way. And that's why we're here to have this training. We can see that youth are young adults, that they're children of tax-paying parents, and that there are future leaders. That transit gives them access to so many different community supports and opportunities. And that's why you as a trainer are so important to be a trusted resource for them. And more than that, when we look at a stat that's given by Dr. Anna Zebarts, who is a very big transit researcher in the space, you'll see that youth make up about 25% of people who can't drive or choose not to. And that really shows how when we're able to go and help these youth choose transit, it helps to empower mobility and equity, particularly in a group who may not be able to go any other way. So that's why you as a trainer is so important, that we overcome maybe some of these biases we might have around youth so that we can see and help them see that we're there to help them. So that's the first part, is checking our biases. We can go on to the next slide, where it's so important that we show youth that they are in control with transit. Now, oftentimes you might see like a narrative go on in media where, oh, I don't have control of the bus. I have to wait for the bus's schedule. It's so hard to get around because I have no control. If that's where our youth is coming in, that's okay. But it's so important that through our training, we shift the narrative. Instead of it being like the bus is something that's controlled by other people, no, the bus gives you the freedom to control your own life. Instead of relating or waiting for mom and dad or an older sibling to be able to drive you around, you can take the bus, and that gives you autonomy and opportunity. It gives you access to school, jobs, supports, and social connections, like Dan talked about before. And when we're doing training for youth, it's so important to go and, tell them that through getting this training, they have the ability to teach up and influence parents to use transit or to think better about transit. So again, coming back to that study that we did in Edmonton, when youth learn how to ride and they feel more confident riding, it helps to bring parents with them. Because when a youth says, no, mama, I feel confident riding, I feel capable of riding, and I have all this training by this trusted source that you also trust, parents can calm down a little bit with some of the biases they may have and go, oh, okay, I trust you, sweetheart, that you can go and ride by yourself. And that's a really big thing. So that's the beauty that this transit training can bring. And it's something that we have to communicate with our youth because it helps to empower them, both in their own life, but also in their immediate circle with their family, that they have the ability to go and build independence and become lifelong riders and have lifelong mobility habits. And while we're talking about this idea about independence and lifelong mobility habits, let's talk about the next slide, where when we're not just talking about control that we bring through youth with transit, we should also talk about the benefits. Now, I want to direct your attention towards this figure. This talks about in the last 4 generations, if we include the current one, the difference in where youth are able to go when they're children. So if you look 3 generations ago at the great-grandfather, when a great-grandfather is about 8 years old, most people were able to go about 6 miles by walking. If you look 2 generations ago, so at the grandfather's generation, they could go about 1 mile alone at 8 years old. If you look 1 generation ago, so in most parents' generations, at 8 years old, most people were able to go about half a mile away from home when they were 8 years old. And now when you compare to today, most kids are only able to go about 300 yards, so to the end of their street. by themselves. And that lack of mobility that youth have, which, starts in childhood, but oftentimes creeps into their teenage years, can affect their mental well-being. And there was actually a study done by Peter Gray, as well as many of his colleagues, looking at the decline of independent activity as a cause for decline in children's mental well-being. And that's why training is so important, because training for transit gives youth mobility. And when youth realize that it's a benefit to them, that it helps them to get around, and that it gives them themselves the equity to move freely, well, then we help to go and prevent anxiety and depression because it helps to give them access to those community supports. And if we look at some stats that come out of Halifax, we can see that 86.6% of high school students reported that having a transit pass made them feel more independent in their daily travel. And that was something that 88.9% of parents agreed with. So again, a really important stat that we should bring to our youth when we're doing this training, because it helps to show them why having transit for themselves and for their peers is so important. So we talked so far already about making sure that we're a trusted source by going over our biases, by making sure that we talk about how transit gives them control. And we talked about how important it is to go and talk about the benefits, because then it gives youth the power to see why it's something that's very safe for them to use. Now, the next thing that's important that we'll see in the next slide is the importance of creating certainty to ride. Because now that you have all these wonderful ideas about transit, youth need to know how to use it. And that starts with their ability to go and plan a ride and to plan a ride safely. Now, something that kind of separates youth from many adults is that many youth in that grade 9 category won't have access to a mobile phone. And if they have access to a mobile phone, not all of them will have access to data. So that means how they plan a ride might look different than most of us. So instead of them, whenever they want, pulling out their phone where they can search on Google Maps how to get around, they might need to do some of the steps in advance when they have Wi-Fi. So that's why it's really important that when we're doing our training on how to use the bus, we also include some of those first steps that helps them to get onto the bus. And that's actually a resource that we're trying to create here at Get on the Bus. It's in the works. So again, if you're not on our newsletter, you should join so that when we do a webinar about that, you can kind of see what those resources look like. But some things to make sure that you kind of talk about as you're doing your transit training is a little bit about ride planning. So talking to the youth, how do they find where they want to go? What buses can they take to go there and back? Where are the bus stops? And how long will that trip take? And while they're at it, it's also important to go and talk about some of those ride safety aspects. So making sure they know where exactly that system, that bus line, or that LRT line goes, and how far that system goes, and how late do the buses run. So if they go one stop more, what can they do? Do they have to go to a bus stop on the other side so that they come back? Or is it a loop where they can just stay on and they can wait to make sure that they get back? And it's also important to kind of talk about ways they can get around potential issues. So, for example, if you don't have access to data, that's okay. Just go on Google Maps, make sure you search in your location of where you want to go from your start to destination, and take a screenshot. And take a screenshot not only of that route, but also other routes that happen around that time. So these are ways that we can work around some of the barriers that youth may face, and it helps to create more certainty for them. If we go on to the next slide, we can also see the importance of creating equity. And equity both in our training, but also to show the equity in the transit system. And it starts first with familiarity for people to feel that sense of equity. So in our training, if you're able to do it on a bus, showing how it's one seat per person, that it have large items like backpack, it goes on their lap or under the seat in front of them. It can help them build a familiarity of what is the courtesy of the bus. But also when we talk about things like accessible seating and making sure accessible seating is available during our training sessions for those who might need it, it's another important aspect because it shows that not only youth themselves will be riding, there's people from a variety of different backgrounds who utilize the bus, and it helps people every single day. Now, in your training, you might be working with newcomer or refugee youth. And for youth where English or French might not be their first language, it might be a good idea to have some different language options. So if you're able to work with different partners, such as like a newcomer organization that might be in your community, that can be a way you can do transit training more effectively. And even when you're in the bus system, you can point out some of the language features that we have. So, for example, you can point out that maybe the ticker is there so people who cannot hear the announcement are able to see what the next stop is. And it's also announced audibly, so for people who can't see the ticker can hear what's going on. All of those are really important language features that kind of help people to get around safer on transit. And again, it's always important to point out other courtesies, like Dan mentioned, like not eating food, like a bowl of cereal on the bus, and not smoking. Because again, it helps people who might have scent allergies to be able to get around. So again, that courtesy aspect, but also that equity aspect. Let's go on to the next slide where we talk about how when we're creating our training, it's so important that we align it to the different plans happening in our community. So be it that it's a community climate plan or a youth engagement plan, a mobility plan or a servants plan. Our community has so many different guiding reports where something like transit training can fall under if you're coming from a municipality side. So that's a great way that we can go and help create transit training opportunities for our youth. And it's also something that creates value and helps to invest in our youth and our community to use those resources that are all around us. But let's say, you're not coming from a municipality side, you're coming from a community organization. That's okay too. We have a lot of community plans and many missions within our community groups that we can approach other partners to talk about how we align. So again, that's another way that we can build those partnerships to help create these programs or possibly to see if we can utilize the shared resources between all the different groups working in our communities so that we can help move our youth forward together. Now, let's move on to the next slide where we talk about how to build youth leadership, starting on one of the easiest levels. And even though it might sound counterintuitive, direct questioning can be really helpful for younger youth over open-ended prompts. Now, let me kind of explain by giving you a little bit of an example of my own life. If I was to go and throw you inside my third-year engineering class when you have done absolutely no math or physics, you might feel really lost if I talk for 25 minutes and then ask, does anyone have any questions? Right? And the same thing is for youth who are riding the bus. Sometimes creating the opportunities for people to go, does anyone know what the red stop button's for? Or does anyone know how to stop the bus? Or raise of hands who has ridden a bus before? Creating those very purposeful places for people to interact can help start to build that youth leadership where they can feel safe interacting with you as a trusted source. And it also allows that for you to do call outs in other different ways where you go and talk to whoever the trainer is after the session. So that helps people who are maybe more introverted to have that time to go and talk about what they may need in a safer setting. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we'll also see that there's many different opportunities for training that might not be conventional training. And we'll talk about an initiative we did here on Get on the Bus to help explain. So at Emmy Lazert High School in Edmonton, we worked with 45 newcomer and art students to paint a mural about where transit helps them to get in their community. And with all these ideas that youth brought, we arranged them in accordance to the Mending Signal, with homes for belonging in the top left section, with sports and workplaces for mastery in the top right section, with hospital and Saskatoon berry bushes in the bottom right section, again for generosity, and then for the bus representing independence in the bottom left section. And through this process, we worked with our partners, being both the school and Action for Healthy Communities, to go and explain to these newcomer and refugee students what is the importance of the bus and how do they ride the bus. And it was a very fulfilling process for many of our youth, which we saw in our exit interviews, where youth were able to say, I know how to ride the bus now, or I can ride the bus to go to the mall, I can ride the bus to go to work, I can ride the bus to go see a family member. I can ride the bus to get to Action for Healthy Communities. All these knowledge building that they were able to get from this experience helped them to see why transit is important for not only them, but for other people. And that's something that it's ways we can do transit training that's not just on the bus training. So again, showing there's many training options besides one of them that we talked extensively about today. So That's one part. If we go on to the next slide, we can also talk about another mechanism of doing transit training for youth, and that's a peer-to-peer ambassadorship program. Now, this is something we're actually currently working on Get on the Bus, and it should come out within the next year. So again, if you're on our newsletter or not on our newsletter yet, you should get on it so you can see a lot of the great resources we have for onboarding youth to be peer-to-peer leaders, as well as kind of some of those next steps. And the reason why we're talking about a peer-to-peer ambassadorship program, or basically youth teaching other youth how to ride transit, is that in a 2025 survey by the City of Halifax, we saw that 75% of youth said that they would find a peer-led transit training program helpful, or they were open to it. And that was something that 94% of parents agreed with. So that peer aspect can help to provide that continuous support so that youth knows how to get around in more time than just that 25-minute on the bus session. So again, another really great resource that we can build in our communities. And talking about that youth leadership aspect, let's talk about our youth co-design. Youth co-design, and this is actually a method that comes from a research paper published last year, where there's many different ways that we can engage youth on a variety of different levels. So on the lowest level of engagement, we have informed. So informed means that youth receive information, but they don't really have a lot of decision-making power in that decision. But when we're able to get youth onto a bus, they can be present, and that presence helps them to go farther together and to also know some of those next steps. When we consult youth, they're like asking them questions or asking them feedback. We build more engagement and more buy-in into the importance of transit. And that goes on and on when we go up the levels all the way to youth leadership, where they see the power of the transit and they feel actively involved in it. So again, many different ways that we can involve youth when we're doing our transit training. And I'll pass it back to Dan, who will talk about key takeaways from the session.
Thank you, Sophia. And just a couple slides here, and we'll open up for questions. So some of the key takeaways I think we see here are that idea of hands-on training, the best you can get to start in the community and then move it up to something that's very systemic, builds confidence and independence. We know that peer leadership, this idea that I think I'm seeing questions come in. I think it's such a great thing to continue to build out in our communities about how to work with existing structures to build out and help build that confidence over time, because it really does help just having these set up. Accessibility and inclusion as a whole between the program design and what investing in youth transit does in our communities is imperative, as well as partnerships. We're all trying to do different things. There's a lot of good organizations, good people doing good things. If we could take that breath and work together on some of these things, I think we can solve and work towards multiple outcomes. The ride guide, as I said, it's just being finished up. If you're part of this webinar, I had a question. It was, can we use the resources? Yes, all this recording will be online. This ride guide will be out soon, and you'll be first to get it. This is what Get on the Bus is about. It's about getting access, sharing, amplifying, supporting. So some of the resources that are available. If you go on the Get on the Bus at any time, we built out a really good repertoire of all the policy side of communities doing free and some access, reducing barriers, different programs. We're doing our best. If you see stuff that don't exist, please get it to us. Email me directly and I'll bring us to the team. If you're looking for coaching in a way of looking and talking through maybe a training program, we're here to support. This is thanks to our great funders. Get custom help, as I said, the digital access and tools, as Sophia said, we're building more and more and trying to, some of the things I've seen come in, build more resource to share, right? Just share, right? To help each other. Let's move and build this momentum together. This is open access because we want as many people to get involved, support, create, because there is nuance, and the more we can learn from each other, I think the better. With that being said, thank you again. We're going to open it up to Q&A. I have some questions in front of me that have trickled in through the chat, and I'm just going to move to one last slide to make sure that information's up there as we go through Q&A. So Sophia, I actually have a quick question that came in dedicated to you, if that's okay. Speaking of risk, transit training occurs in a highly controlled environment where the safety risks of riding are very low and mitigated. How can we incorporate preparing youth for real world risky scenarios such as feeling uncomfortable on transit or being approached involuntarily in our training sessions? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think this really comes back to what Dan was saying earlier, where we remind you that transit is a public space. And while there's a lot of opportunities to have really good connections for other people, sometimes we might run into unfavorable people along the way. So if you don't feel safe where you are, and I actually had this experience a couple days ago on transit, move towards the front of the bus, move to the front of your LRT line. At the next stop, you can always get off and move to another car. And this is a lot of ways where you can help build safety for yourself because you, again, have the choice to stay in transit. And if you don't feel like it's safe, you can always move somewhere else where there's more safety. And talk to your driver, right? Your drivers are there to protect you. The transit operators are there to protect you. Many different transit systems have resources for safety, like click here to go and put an emergency stop, or text this line, and we'll make sure that there's police officers there to help you at another stop or another station. So lots of different resources there to help you. They just need to know about it.
And I'd echo that with some of the things that I've seen firsthand with safety training as well. Just that idea of making sure they advocate and know that these are opportunities for them and demonstrate it. I think that's important. But also highlight that, not to scare, but I always say, I'm not trying to scare you. There's 5 to 600,000 rides by high school students in Kingston Transit a year, but you're growing up and this is a public place. And just like any public place, you can advocate and make sure you mitigate as much as you can. I have another question here. And Sophia, I think we can both maybe jam on this if that's okay. One is, can youth become trainers or mentors themselves?
Can you speak? Yeah, honestly, yeah. Like, there's so many times where someone will come up to me, or I go up to other youth and I ask, "Excuse me, do you know, will this line take me to this place?" And sometimes youth are able to go, "Yeah, this is how you can get there, and this is the stop you get off at." Or sometimes they go, like, "I don't know, let me check Google, because I have data on my phone, even if you don't, and I'll help you get there." So there's a lot of ways where youth can help other people, and that echoes the sentiment that Dan kind of talked about earlier, where if you're able to help identify some youth who have rid transit before in that group, you can help make sure that the youth who don't feel very comfortable riding know some faces of people they can go to go and ask for help, saying that your classmates are your greatest resource coming out of this program because they can be there for that continuous support.
And I think that's also adding on that, Sophia, of what we're working on. And I think what's identified in Halifax and other places, how do we create kind of opportunities for other organizations to work with leadership, whether it be the materials, the curriculum, the connections, right? And I've just seen it like on the launch that we had webinar in 2003 with Get on the Bus. We had 2 students Zoom in from a high school from Kingston, grade 9, Josh and Maeve. I always remember this. It was just so nice to see, and Josh he says, my friend didn't get to training that day. And he says, and that one day we went out and he tried to get on the back door. So I showed him how. And that's the idea of normalizing and helping each other because they will help each other. And knowing that younger youth also probably don't use it quite as much as until they get a bit older. They have opportunity to learn in those safe environments, whether it's just the route they use to get to their parents or their, the wherever, right? And so that's why I think starting and systemically doing it's not just one session. There can be a lot of little points that add in, but it will progress throughout their high school career. And speaking of that, Sophia, how can we keep maybe building off of what I said there a bit, how can we keep the momentum going after one session? Like if it's just one training session, what are other opportunities do you think?
So again, relying on those other resources, people there, so that the youth can continue to have that support. And I also think it's really important that we show up with the transit system at a variety of different events. So training can happen on the bus orientation, but it can also happen in a farmer's market where you bring a bike rack that sits on the front of the bus and you show people how do you load onto a bike. And it's something that we can continuously build in a variety of different settings.
And a lot of transit agencies across Canada are working in the community at events and things, and so just different ways to couple already existing work is to stack on it more of that youth lens, which is a great one. I also have some more questions coming in, so I'm just looking down at them here. And I think, Sophie, I'd like you to start this one if it's okay, and I have some thoughts as well. But do you think there needs to be an equivalent training or information session to parents? And how do you make sure parents are on board?
I think it's really important that you have parents on board. From the research that I've seen, there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. So some ways is you have the parents come do the training with kids. That's one way where you can get parents on board. There's parents' nights at a lot of different schools. That's another way that you can make sure parents are involved. And it's really important that we show parents the statistics on the benefits. And we also talk about the benefits within the community, benefits coming from neighboring communities, because it helps parents to see that more and more it's okay. And that if their children ever come in a situation that might feel unsafe, then they have the resources there to make sure that they are safe. So those are just some really important messages we have to get there, well, out there to the parents.
And I
And
think
Dan,
also,
I'm sure you have many.
well, yeah, a couple. I usually have around this one here is what I've realized too over my years is just that parents are a huge decision maker in the youth for a lot of youth, right? But not, and so it's important you communicate to that as well, right? Like it's important in the messaging, the setup. It's important that other parents advocate how it helps them. Once the parents are seeing the caregiver time, the opportunity, getting to school, um, these types of programs really help parents, right? And so I think that, once it's matured and stuff, if it's systematic, I think I was at lunch the other day and the person didn't know me and they said, "You're the guy that does that?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He said, "My daughter wouldn't be able to get to dance class if it wasn't for that." Right. And so you have parents that advocate for their kids using it. And I think that's a big part of doing something systemically over time as well. Anything else on that, Sophia?
Not too much. I think that when you get more and more youth involved and it becomes more normalized, more parents come along the way.
Yeah, no, I'd
It
agree.
just takes time.
Here's a good one. I'm curious about whether you include any advocacy training as part of the program for better bus service or contacting representatives or writing op-eds to delegating in committees. And so right now, the one thing that we say that we're working on, I think, and I'll send it to you in a second, Sophia, but in the bigger picture, right now, our small, diligent, dedicated, and passionate team, we're building the systems to help us, I think, share, promote, coach, and this is thanks to all the funders that are helping us. One actual exciting program around advocacy. And it's not general advocacy as our movement to organization right now. It's very specific to our key audience, right? The youth. Maybe, Sophia, can you give a little bit of light of some of the next one of the things we're working on next as well?
Yeah, so we were able to get a grant for the Youth Harbor Foundation and for $40,000 to go and create a program where we're working with 50 different youth advocates all across the country to talk about what are their key takeaways that they've had and to help share that knowledge to other youth who are starting their transit advocacy journey. So that includes things like delegation, how to write a press advisory, a press release, but also some of those other practices that come with grassroots organizing. Like, how do you create a strategy? How do you talk to a city councilor? How do you find funding? How do you keep good records so that when you have to do succession planning, it becomes easy? So we are working with that with many, many different youth across the country so that we can help share those resources coming from many different communities and community sizes.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm excited. That's a bit next step as we keep on evolving. We've got a great foundation with team and what we put together, I think, so far of good information and good people working on it. All of you watching today, I appreciate it. Last question, I think, with time. How essential do you think it is that transit be free in order to prioritize transit training for youth? Here in Metro Vancouver, youth under 12 ride for free, but this excludes high school students. So I'm going to start this one if it's okay, quick, Sophia. It's just I would start somewhere. Free for youth, like this is what opens up the value in community. And sometimes the word free is it's going to be paid for somewhere, but we're using tax dollars in a lot of ways, and this is a multi-solving solution, right? And so I think in a bigger picture, what we're seeing across Canada to get some of the numbers and get some of the usage, that is definitely it opens doors. Not every community, maybe from a transit system side, is prepared for the influx too right away, right? And so sometimes transit programs can be built with intent and thought, but with in out. And so I think that that is one side that can be advocated for it as important. But as I say, for any part of youth transit, start somewhere. And so you could start with a geography class, training, work in your community, build partnerships, just see what works. And Sophia, maybe yourself, and we'll finish it up. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, like I'd say, definitely free is a really great way to create that value and really remove that intimidation and price factor that comes with riding transit. And it helps to create that long-term riders. We have a lot of different reports that show that. But again, we start wherever we are and where our community is. So even if we don't have fair transit for high school students yet, we can still do training. And that's one of the beautiful things about training because we can still help normalize it, even if all the resources aren't there yet to make it fair free. And that's something that we can see like from a lot of the comments that we are getting in the chat, all those stories where when we normalize training, when people know about the resource that's there, they can get to school on time. They build connections. They meet people they would maybe never talk to in other places of their life. And you get to know those same people every single day.
Thank you, Sophia. And thank you all for attending. Just the last comments here is please visit the website and see what's there. Connect with us. We're here to be connected too. That's what our time is doing. Any of Sophia, myself, and our team's support on where you are with your community, one-on-one calls. Share your stories with us. If you have reports or other engagements that we haven't mentioned, please send it our way. That's our goal, is to create this movement with you. And so thanks again for taking the time out of your day. And I hope you have a great rest of this Thursday. Thank you.